Tulsa, Oklahoma, April 5, 1998. The morning sun rose over Maplewood Street, painting the rooftops with a golden warmth that made the day feel almost sacred. Church bells echoed through the air, mingling with the scent of dew on trimmed lawns and the soft hum of families preparing for Sunday service. It was the kind of morning that made everything seem safe, ordinary, eternal. Inside a small brick house on the corner, Eli Parker, 13 years old, tied his sneakers and looked toward his mother. "I'll ride ahead, Mom. I promised Pastor Lee I'd help set up the hymn books." His voice carried that easy mix of pride and impatience only a teenager could have. His mother, Claire Parker, smiled as she adjusted his collar. "Stay on Maple Avenue, honey. And don't forget to lock your bike at the church fence." Eli grinned, slinging his small backpack over his shoulder. "Got it." Then he pushed off down the quiet street, the morning sun flashing off the chrome of his bicycle spokes. Claire stood at the window watching him disappear behind a row of sycamores. She didn't know it would be the last time she'd ever see him. Before we continue with this heartbreaking true story, make sure to subscribe for more real stories that remind us how fragile and powerful human truth can be. By noon, the sound of church bells had faded, replaced by whispers of confusion. The Sunday service had started, but Eli never arrived. His friends looked toward the entrance every few minutes, expecting to see his easy smile appear through the doors. He didn't. When Claire reached the church an hour later, she saw Pastor Lee pacing near the front steps. "He's probably helping someone on the way," he said, though his voice betrayed unease. But as the afternoon stretched into evening, unease turned to panic. The police were called. Volunteers gathered with flashlights and dogs. The golden calm of the morning dissolved into a restless grey night, filled with shouts echoing across fields and alleys. "Eli! Eli Parker!" Voices cried out again and again, breaking against the quiet air like a plea to the heavens. Detective Mark Holloway arrived just before midnight, his shirt wrinkled, his face young but already weary. "We'll find him, Mrs. Parker," he told Claire, though he didn't meet her eyes. He had seen that kind of fear before, the kind that clings to a parent's voice long after hope starts to fade. By sunrise, only the sound of wind and a single creaking swing remained in the park, where Eli had last been seen. A lonely bicycle track led into the trees and vanished near the old bridge. Tulsa awoke to headlines that would haunt it for years. 13-year-old boy vanishes on way to church. And as dawn broke over the silent neighborhood, Claire sat on her porch steps, gripping Eli's jacket to her chest. She whispered into the still air, "He'll come home. He has to." But deep down, a quiet truth settled in her heart. Something sacred had been taken from their town that Sunday morning, something that would never return unchanged. By Monday morning, Tulsa was no longer the same. Flyers with Eli Parker's smiling face appeared on every lamppost, taped crookedly by trembling hands. The white letters, "Missing, last seen Sunday morning," glared against the bright spring sky. The town, once defined by its quiet rhythm and open friendliness, began to shift into something taut and uncertain. At the Parker house, the phone rang constantly. Neighbors, church members, reporters. Claire sat at the kitchen table, holding a cup of untouched coffee, staring at the phone as if willing it to bring her son's voice. Her sister, Martha, had flown in from Kansas City overnight. "You have to eat something," she whispered, setting a plate of toast in front of her. Claire didn't look up. "He's never stayed out past dark, not once. He hates being late." Her words broke halfway through the sentence. Across town, Detective Mark Holloway led a morning briefing at the station. He was 29, idealistic, a man who believed every case mattered. "We start with the route from his house to the church," he told his team. "Door-to-door canvassing, every witness counts. Don't assume anything." His partner, Officer Dana McKinney, added softly, "People are scared, Mark. They'll talk if we listen." By afternoon, more than 50 volunteers were combing through fields, drainage ditches, and wooded trails. The air smelled of wet earth and cut grass. "We'll find him," someone murmured, though no one said how. The church opened its doors for prayer. Pastor Samuel Lee, an elderly man with kind eyes, spoke quietly to the small crowd gathered in the pews. "Eli is one of us. We will not let fear break what faith has built." Yet even he glanced at the door each time it creaked, as if expecting the boy to walk in and end the nightmare. Television crews arrived by evening. The glow of their camera lights spilled across the Parkers' front yard like artificial daylight. A reporter called out, "Mrs. Parker, do you believe your son was taken?" Claire froze at the question. Mark stepped in front of her. "No comment tonight," he said firmly, shielding her from the flashes. Afterward, he stood by his car, hands on the roof, staring at the stars barely visible through the haze. He'd handled thefts, accidents, even a homicide. But this, a missing child, hollowed something inside him. At midnight, volunteers lit candles outside the church. The flickering light cast long shadows across the parking lot. Martha wrapped an arm around Claire as she whispered, "They'll find him, I know they will." Claire's voice was faint. "You don't know Tulsa like I do. When something disappears here, it doesn't always come back." Mark overheard those words as he walked past. He paused, looking toward the dark horizon where searchlights swept over the fields. He made a silent promise to himself that this case wouldn't fade like so many others. But in his gut, a cold truth stirred. Finding Eli wouldn't just test the department, it would test the faith of an entire town. The third day came with cold rain, washing the chalk marks and footprints from the roadside. Hope, once loud and restless, now moved in whispers. Detective Mark Holloway sat in his unmarked car outside the church, the windshield fogging as he flipped through his notepad. Dozens of interviews, half a dozen so-called witnesses, yet every lead dissolved under scrutiny. A teenage boy claimed he'd seen a white van parked near the corner, where Eli's bike usually passed. Another woman swore she'd noticed a man standing by the bridge, just watching. When officers followed up, the van belonged to a florist making Sunday deliveries, and the man by the bridge was a retired veteran feeding stray cats. Each dead end tightened the weight in Mark's chest. Inside the police station, the sound of phones ringing blurred into static. "We're chasing ghosts," said Officer Dana McKinney, rubbing her temples. "Every call is another, maybe." Mark leaned against the file cabinet, eyes fixed on the photo pinned to the board. Eli, smiling in a baseball cap, a blue sky behind him. "There's always something," he murmured. "We just haven't looked in the right place yet." At home, Claire Parker refused to let herself sleep. The living room was littered with maps and notepads, circles marking neighborhoods, alleys, parks. Her sister Martha sat beside her on the couch. "You can't keep going like this," she said softly. Claire didn't answer at first. Her hand traced Eli's handwriting on a note he'd left weeks earlier. "Don't forget to pick up milk, Mom, love you." She swallowed hard. "If I stop," she said finally, "then it means I've accepted he's gone, and I can't." Each day bled into the next. The local news cycled the same footage. Officers searching, neighbors praying, Claire pleading for information. Donations poured in for the reward fund, but still, no answers came. Mark began to feel the invisible pressure from his superiors, subtle reminders about department resources and public expectations. He knew what that meant. On the 12th day, he stood outside the Parker house, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Claire opened the door before he could knock. "You didn't find him," she said flatly. He exhaled, the words bitter in his throat. "Not yet." "But we're not giving up." Her eyes met his, raw, exhausted, searching for something solid in a world that had lost its shape. "Then promise me," she whispered. "Promise you'll keep looking, even when everyone else stops." Mark nodded slowly. "I will." But as he walked back to his car, he knew how these stories usually ended. Time dulls urgency. Files gather dust. New cases take priority. The city forgets. That night, in the small hours, he reopened the case file anyway, flipping through pages worn at the edges. He circled one name, a witness who'd lived near the creek but had never been properly interviewed. It was thin, maybe meaningless, but it was something. He closed the file, his reflection faint in the window beside Eli's picture. "You deserve better than silence," he said under his breath. Outside, thunder rolled across the Oklahoma sky, carrying the uneasy truth of a town beginning to lose faith, not just in finding Eli, but in its own certainty of what was real. 5 years passed and Tulsa had learned to move forward, or at least pretend it had. The Parker house still stood on Maplewood Street, though the white paint had begun to peel and the flower beds were overrun with weeds. The neighborhood had changed too. New families moved in. Children rode bikes along the same route Eli once took, and yet, every spring Sunday carried a quiet weight, the memory of what was lost. Claire Parker had become a different woman. The warmth in her eyes had faded into something steadier, harder. She now spent her days volunteering for a missing children's foundation, organizing fundraisers and speaking at schools about safety. Every time she stood behind a microphone, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice never wavered. "Someone out there always knows something," she would say. "Don't ever stop asking." After the talks, people often came to thank her, parents, teachers, even officers. But when the crowd dispersed and the applause faded, the silence returned. She still set a place for Eli at the dinner table every April 5th. Not because she expected him to come home, but because it reminded her he was real, not just a headline. Detective Mark Holloway had changed too. The eager young cop from '98 had become a man who carried his failures like shadows stitched to his uniform. He'd solved other cases, robberies, assaults, even a high-profile kidnapping, but none had closed the hollow inside him that belonged to Eli Parker. He kept the file in his bottom desk drawer beneath newer folders. Every now and then, when the station quieted after midnight, he'd pull it out and reread every note, every interview. It was a ritual, half penance, half obsession. His new partner, Officer Ray Duncan, once asked, "Why keep torturing yourself over something that's cold?" Mark didn't answer right away. He looked at the boy's faded photograph clipped to the file. "Because it's not just a case," he said finally. "It's a promise I haven't kept." Tulsa itself seemed to carry echoes of that promise. Locals still remembered the search parties, the candlelight vigils, the day the newspaper stopped printing updates. For many, the disappearance of Eli Parker had become a story told in lowered voices, a symbol of innocence lost. One humid evening, as Mark drove home past the old church, he noticed the signboard had changed. The wooden letters read, "Faith endures when answers fade." He slowed, pulling to the side of the road. For a long moment he just stared at the darkened steeple, its cross silhouetted against the setting sun. Somewhere deep inside he felt that faint pull again, that whisper of unfinished work. But logic pushed back. There were no new witnesses, no new leads, only a mother's grief and a detective's guilt, both suspended in time. Still, as the crickets began to hum and the streetlights flickered on, Mark couldn't shake the thought that stories like Eli's never truly end. They just wait. And sometimes all it takes is a single overlooked detail to bring the past back to life. It was a late summer morning in 2003 when the call came in. Detective Mark Holloway was halfway through his first cup of coffee at the station when the dispatcher's voice crackled through the intercom. "You'll want to hear this," she said. "Construction crew found something out near Riverside Drive." Looks old. By the time Mark arrived, the air was heavy with heat, the kind that stuck to your skin and made every breath taste like dust. A construction foreman waved him over, pointing toward a fenced-off section of earth where bulldozers had carved deep trenches. "We were clearing the area for the new development," the man said, his voice uneasy. "One of my guys hit something metal. Thought it was junk until he saw the shape." Mark crouched near the edge of the dig. Half buried in clay was a rusted bicycle frame, its paint long faded. The small bell on the handlebar was still intact, though crushed flat. For a moment he just stared, his heart thudding in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. "Get the evidence team here," he said quietly. Within hours, the site was sealed. Technicians in gloves and masks moved carefully around the discovery. One lifted a small chain fragment into a bag, marked Item 004. Mark stood back, silent. He didn't need confirmation, not yet. But deep down, he already knew whose bike it was. When the results came in 2 days later, the DNA on the handle grips matched Eli Parker. The report landed on Mark's desk with a single sticky note from the lab tech. "You were right to keep looking. He didn't smile. Instead, he sat still for a long time, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the room. The case file, once yellowed and forgotten, now lay open before him. "Welcome back," he murmured under his breath. That evening he drove to the Parker house. The porch light flickered weakly as Claire opened the door, her expression wary. "Detective Holloway," she said. "After all this time?" Mark removed his hat, his voice soft. "We found something, near the old church route." Her hands trembled. "Is it—" He nodded once. "The bicycle. It's been confirmed." Claire sank into the nearest chair, her breath catching between disbelief and sorrow. "All these years," she whispered, "I told myself he'd just— maybe, but—" Her words faded, replaced by the sound of quiet sobs. Mark sat across from her, the wooden chair creaking beneath his weight. "I don't know what it means yet, but it's something. It's a start." She wiped her tears, looking up at him with a fragile steadiness. "Then promise me you won't stop this time." "I won't," he said. And he meant it. That night, as he drove home, the radio played softly, an old country song about coming home. The irony wasn't lost on him. Somewhere in the darkness of Tulsa, a buried truth had finally pushed its way to the surface. But Mark knew that finding the bike wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of everything that had been waiting, silently, to be found. The discovery of the bicycle reignited a storm that Tulsa hadn't felt in years. Reporters gathered outside police headquarters, cameras flashing like restless lightning. For the first time since 1998, the words "Eli Parker case" were back on the evening news. Inside the department, Detective Mark Holloway stared at the case file now sitting at the top of his desk. Reopened, marked with a fresh red tag, "Active Investigation." He'd been through hundreds of files in his career, but none felt like this. When he opened it, the smell of old paper and ink mixed with something else, memory. "Let's start from zero," he said to his new partner, Ray Duncan, who leaned against the doorframe, sipping coffee. "You really think there's anything left to find after 5 years?" Ray asked. Mark didn't look up. "There's always something. We just have to listen differently." Forensic technology had evolved since '98, and now small traces that once meant nothing could speak loudly. The evidence room became their second home. They pulled every item logged from the original case, Eli's backpack, a torn piece of shirt fabric, the broken bicycle chain, and sent them for reanalysis under new protocols. When the lab technician Lisa McAdams handed Mark a clipboard days later, her tone carried a cautious excitement. "There's something on the backpack zipper," she said. "A partial fingerprint. It's faint, but modern imaging might give us a usable match." Mark felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to feel in years, hope. "Run it against every database we've got," he told her. Meanwhile, Claire Parker received the update from the department. She met Mark at a small diner off Route 66, the same one they'd spoken in years earlier. She stirred her coffee slowly, her voice steady but thin. "You think this means that someone really did something to him?" Mark paused. "I think it means someone was there, closer than we knew." Claire's eyes filled with quiet resolve. "Then find them." When he left the diner, the Oklahoma sky was bruised with evening colors, violet and orange bleeding into each other. Mark stood by his car for a moment, watching the streetlights blink to life. There was a heaviness in his chest that he couldn't shake. He'd chased ghosts before, but this time, it wasn't just about the case. It was about redemption, about keeping the promise he'd made to a mother and a boy whose smile had haunted his dreams for 5 years. Back at the precinct, the hum of computers filled the silence. Mark watched the fingerprint scan render slowly on the screen, each pixel forming something almost familiar. "Come on," he whispered. "Talk to me." Ray glanced over his shoulder. "You think this'll actually crack it?" Mark didn't answer. He just stared, the faint outline of the print growing clearer. Outside, thunder rolled across the flat Oklahoma plain, echoing through the night. For the first time in half a decade, the case wasn't fading into the past. It was breathing again, faintly, but enough to make everyone in that small office feel the weight of what might be coming. The fingerprint analysis took 9 days, 9 long days of waiting, hoping, and preparing for disappointment. Detective Mark Holloway had grown used to false alarms, but something about this felt different. On the 10th morning, he found a yellow envelope on his desk marked Confidential, Match Found. He opened it slowly, his pulse rising with every line. The name printed at the top stopped him cold. Gary Rowland. For a moment he just stared at the page, repeating the name silently. He knew it. Everyone in Tulsa did, at least vaguely. Gary had been the janitor at St. Matthew's Church back in '98, friendly, soft-spoken, always smiling as he swept the hallways or fixed the leaky faucets. He'd left the job suddenly the following year, claiming his mother was sick and he needed to move to Arkansas. No one had questioned it then. Why would they? Mark's hands trembled slightly as he set the report down. "It's him," he said quietly. Officer Ray Duncan walked over. "You've got to be kidding. The church janitor, the one everyone liked?" Mark nodded, eyes distant. That's the problem with people like him. They blend in so well that you stop seeing them. By noon, the department buzzed with whispers. Old parishioners called in, their voices thick with disbelief. Gary? No way. He was kind. He helped with the kids. Others grew quiet, remembering moments that now felt different. 2 attentive smiles, hands that lingered too long on a shoulder. That evening, Mark drove out to Claire Parker's home. She opened the door slowly, her face pale from the glow of the porch light. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked before he could speak. He hesitated, then nodded. "A name, someone who worked at the church when Eli disappeared." Claire's voice trembled. "Who?" "Gary Rowland." For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then she whispered, "He was at the potluck that night. He carried the chairs in from the basement." Her hand went to her mouth. He smiled at Eli. Mark's jaw tightened. "We're reopening every file connected to him. Employment records, background checks, everything. I'll find out where he's been." She looked at him, her eyes filled with the kind of pain that doesn't fade, only folds deeper into the soul. "Do you think he did it?" He didn't answer directly. "I think he knows something." That night, Mark sat alone in his car outside the station, listening to the hum of the streetlights. He'd spent years trying to forget this case, but now it was alive again, pulsing with new urgency. A familiar guilt pressed on his chest, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd missed something obvious years ago. He pulled out the old church directory from 1998, tracing his finger over Gary's smiling face in the staff photo. His eyes lingered on the small caption, "Gary Rowland, Maintenance and Grounds." "Why'd you leave, Gary?" he muttered. "And what are you still hiding?" In the stillness of that night, one truth became clear to him. Answers were finally within reach, but so was danger. The name had surfaced, and with it, every buried secret was beginning to stir. Detective Mark Holloway drove south toward Fayetteville, Arkansas, the sun dropping behind him like a burning coin sinking into the horizon. The highway stretched out empty, lined with the brittle grass of late summer. He'd made this drive hundreds of times for other cases, but this one felt personal, like chasing the shadow of a promise he'd once broken. The address from Gary Rowland's employment records led to a quiet suburban street, the kind of place where every mailbox looked the same. He parked across the road, watching as a man in his late 40s stepped out of a small white house. Gary Rowland. He looked softer now, heavier, hair thinning, a lawnmower humming beside him. Mark's stomach tightened at the ordinariness of it all. "He built a new life," he muttered, "like nothing ever happened." When Gary noticed him and walked closer, his expression shifted from curiosity to polite concern. "Can I help you, officer?" Mark held up his badge. "Detective Holloway, Tulsa PD. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your time at St. Matthew's Church." Gary wiped his hands on a towel, his smile faint but steady. "That was a long time ago. You folks still talking about that poor boy?" Mark kept his tone even. "Yes, we are." New evidence came up. Gary's jaw flexed slightly. "I already told the police everything I knew back then. I was working the grounds that morning. Saw the kid ride by on his bike and that's all. Mark studied him carefully. You left Tulsa right after the investigation stalled. Why? Gary shrugged. My mother was sick. You can check the hospital records if you don't believe me. There was confidence in his voice, but something about his eyes betrayed unease. Mark noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cap. Mind if I ask where you were the evening Eli disappeared? Gary met his gaze directly. At the church, fixing a leak in the basement. Ask Pastor Lee if he's still around. He'll remember. Mark nodded slowly, jotting a note in his book. We will. Before turning to leave, he said quietly, if there's anything you didn't say back then, anything you remember now, this is the time to do it. Gary's polite mask slipped for just a second. I already told you what I know, Detective. You can dig all you want, but some things just don't have answers. Mark walked back to his car, the words echoing in his mind. He'd heard that line before, always from people with something to hide. As he started the engine, he glanced once more at the house. Through the window, Gary stood motionless, staring back at him, the glow of the television flickering against his face. The drive back to Tulsa was long and silent. Every mile carried the weight of a truth half buried, waiting to be forced into daylight. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the pulse of determination return. He didn't have proof yet, only a name, a story, and a gut feeling that refused to quiet. But he knew this much. Gary Rowland wasn't done being questioned. Not yet. Back in Tulsa, the lab hummed with quiet precision. Machines blinked under fluorescent lights as the retested evidence from the old St. Matthew's storage closet was processed once again. Dust, fibers, and fragments that had sat untouched for half a decade. Detective Mark Holloway stood beside Lisa McAdams, the forensic specialist, watching as she calibrated a new spectrometer. You really think you'll find something after all this time? He asked. Lisa smiled faintly. Science doesn't forget as easily as people do. She loaded a swab taken from a toolbox once used by Gary Rowland, recovered years earlier during the church's renovations. The department had kept it in storage, logged under miscellaneous property. Now, with new extraction methods, every molecule could tell a story. Hours passed before Lisa appeared in Mark's office, holding a sealed report. Her tone was calm, but her eyes betrayed what the paper confirmed. Trace DNA, she said. Minor transfer, but it matches Eli Parker's profile from the original case sample. Mark leaned back, staring at her. On Gary's tools? She nodded. The wrench handle specifically. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the hum of the air vent. That's not coincidence, he said finally. It's not enough for a conviction, Lisa cautioned, but it's enough to ask questions again. Mark called Claire Parker that afternoon. When she arrived at the precinct, she carried the same composure she'd worn for years, a strength shaped by loss. Mark explained everything carefully, making sure each word was steady. So it's really him? She asked quietly. We can't say for certain yet, but it points in his direction. She folded her hands in her lap, eyes fixed on the window. For years people told me to stop hoping, that maybe not knowing was easier, but knowing, even a piece of it, it hurts, but it's a different kind of hurt. Mark understood. He'd spent years chasing ghosts and now one of them finally had a face. As the story broke to the media, the town reacted with shock. Some refused to believe it. Gary, that can't be true, neighbors said. Others whispered that they'd always found him strange, too quiet, too eager to help. The church released a statement expressing heartbreak and urging patience until the investigation concluded. That night, a community meeting filled the town hall. Claire stood before the crowd, her voice trembling but resolute. This isn't about blame, she said. It's about truth. If something was missed back then, it's time we face it now. Applause rose from the back rows, hesitant at first, then stronger. Among the faces, Mark saw exhaustion and guilt, the shared weight of a town that had once chosen comfort over confrontation. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Claire turned to Mark. If you find proof, what happens next? He paused, choosing his words carefully. Then we finally close the circle. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Then make sure you do. As she walked away, Mark looked down at the report in his hand. The science had spoken, quietly, precisely, without mercy. The past was no longer silent, and now it demanded to be heard. The warrant came through on a grey Thursday morning. Detective Mark Holloway stood in the chief's office as the paper was signed, the sound of the pen scratching across the line sharp and final. "You're sure about this?" the chief asked. Mark nodded once. "It's time." By noon, 2 unmarked cars rolled through the quiet Arkansas suburb. The neighborhood was still, sprinklers ticking across lawns, mail trucks humming past. Mark watched as Gary Rowland stepped onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, wearing the same casual calm that had once fooled an entire town. "Gary Rowland," Mark called out, voice steady but hard. "You're under arrest for the abduction and unlawful death of Eli Parker." Gary froze, mug slipping from his hand and shattering on the steps. For a moment, he looked genuinely confused. What are you talking about?" Mark recited his rights, each word deliberate. Gary's protests grew louder, his voice breaking through the still air. "I didn't do anything. You people never stop. I told you everything I know." The neighbors peeked from behind curtains as officers handcuffed him. One whispered, "That's Gary." "From the church." Another muttered, "He babysat my nephew." Back in Tulsa, the news hit like a storm. Reporters crowded outside police headquarters. Radio stations replayed the announcement every hour. The once-forgotten case had burst back into public memory, and the shock spread faster than the truth could follow. At home, Claire Parker heard the news through a phone call from Mark himself. She stood motionless by the window, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. "It's him, then?" she asked quietly. "We believe so," Mark said. His voice was measured, but exhaustion cracked at the edges. Claire closed her eyes. "I don't know how to feel," she whispered. "Part of me wants to scream, part of me just wants silence." Mark understood. "Justice doesn't always feel clean," he said, "but it's something." That night, as Gary sat in the interrogation room, his calm demeanor began to crumble. "You think because you found some old wrench you've got me?" he said, glaring at the one-way mirror. "You people have no idea what you're doing." Mark entered, setting a photo of Eli on the table, the boy's smile frozen in time. "Then help me understand," he said softly. "Tell me how his DNA ended up on your tools." Gary's jaw tightened. "I fixed things at that church for years. Maybe he touched them, that's all." Mark leaned forward, eyes locked on him. "You left town right after he disappeared. You never came back. You call that coincidence?" Gary didn't answer. His silence said enough. When Mark finally stepped out of the room, he felt no victory, only a heavy quiet settling in his chest. He looked toward the observation window where Claire, allowed to watch the final moments, stood with tears streaming down her face. "I thought this day would feel like the end," she whispered. "But it just feels empty." Mark nodded. "Sometimes the truth doesn't heal, it just stops the bleeding." Outside, the sky darkened over Tulsa, clouds rolling in heavy and low. The arrest had brought answers, but not peace. And for everyone who remembered that Sunday in 1998, nothing would ever feel simple again. Winter settled over Tulsa like a gray blanket, heavy and unrelenting. The courthouse stood solemn against the cold sky, its stone steps slick with frost. For weeks the city had been waiting for this moment. The trial of Gary Rowland, the man accused of stealing away 13-year-old Eli Parker. Detective Mark Holloway sat quietly in the back row, coat folded over his knees as the judge called the court to order. Across the room, Gary sat between his attorneys, expression calm but drained. His hair was thinner, his posture defeated. Yet when he glanced up and saw the crowd, his eyes held a flicker of something that made Mark's stomach turn. Defiance, or maybe indifference. Claire Parker sat near the front, her sister Martha beside her. In her hands, she clutched Eli's old baseball cap, worn at the brim. She'd been warned by prosecutors that the process would be slow, painful, unpredictable, but she came anyway. She wanted to hear every word. The prosecution began with quiet gravity. "This case is not about revenge," the attorney said, his voice echoing softly through the courtroom. It's about acknowledgement of a life cut short and of a truth hidden for far too long. Witnesses came and went. Former church members, neighbors, officers who had searched the fields back in 1998. Each piece built a puzzle that had taken years to reassemble. The new forensic report, the fingerprint, the DNA trace, all were presented carefully, methodically. Gary's defense argued it was coincidence, contamination, desperation from a department hungry for closure. "My client is not a monster," his lawyer said. "He's a scapegoat for a town that needed someone to blame." But when Mark took the stand, the courtroom grew still. He swore in, his voice low but steady. "Detective Holloway," the prosecutor began, "why did you reopen this case after so many years?" Mark met the jury's eyes. "Because unfinished work doesn't stop haunting you. And because Mrs. Parker never stopped believing there was something left to find." The lawyer for the defense smirked. "Or maybe you needed to prove yourself, detective. Maybe you saw what you wanted to see." Mark didn't flinch. "I didn't see what I wanted. I saw what was there." And it pointed to him. He gestured briefly toward Gary, whose face remained unreadable. When Claire was called to testify, the air changed. She spoke not as a mother seeking vengeance, but as a woman who had learned to live with silence. "You don't stop being a mother when your child disappears," she said softly. "You just learn to mother their memory instead." Even the defense attorney lowered his eyes. By late afternoon, the court recessed. People filed out into the cold, their breath rising like smoke. Mark lingered by the steps, the sound of boots crunching on ice behind him. Claire approached, her scarf pulled tight around her neck. "You did well in there," she said quietly. "So did you," he replied. She gave a faint smile. "Tomorrow they'll argue again, and the day after that. But today, I feel like the truth finally has a voice." Mark nodded, glancing up at the courthouse lights flickering against the dusk. For the first time in years, Tulsa seemed to exhale. But justice, like winter, was far from over. The final week of the trial carried an almost unbearable weight. The courthouse halls smelled faintly of coffee and paper, filled with reporters whispering into microphones and families waiting in silence. After nearly a month of testimony, closing arguments began. Detective Mark Holloway sat near the back, his notebook unopened on his lap. He already knew every word by heart. The prosecutor spoke first, his tone calm but resolute. "This case isn't about revenge," he said. "It's about a promise, one made to a 13-year-old boy who never got to grow up. The evidence, the testimony, the timeline, they all tell the same story. Gary Rowland took something from this community that cannot be replaced. It's time we give Eli Parker his name back." Gary's attorney countered with practiced outrage. "You're convicting a man on old files and faded memories. The DNA, circumstantial, the fingerprint, contaminated. There is no body, no confession, no direct proof. You can't convict a man on pain alone." The jury listened, faces unreadable. In the front row, Claire Parker sat motionless, hands clasped around her son's baseball cap, lips moving silently in prayer. When the jury retired to deliberate, the hours dragged. Mark waited in the corridor, his mind cycling through every misstep, every decision that had led to this point. He thought of Eli's bike, the rusted bell, the mother who refused to forget. He knew whatever verdict came next would not bring peace, but it might bring an ending. At dusk, the bailiff called the court back in session. The crowd rose as the jurors filed in. Mark's throat tightened. He'd been in dozens of courtrooms, but this time his pulse raced like a drum in his ears. The foreman stood, holding the slip of paper that would define everything. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Gary Rowland." He paused, the room frozen in silence. "Guilty of kidnapping and manslaughter." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Claire exhaled a sound that was part sob, part release. Gary's shoulders slumped, his face paling as the words settled over him. His lawyer muttered something under his breath, but it was drowned out by the sound of murmurs rising across the room. Mark closed his eyes briefly. It wasn't triumph, it was relief, hollow but necessary. Justice, imperfect as it was, had finally arrived. After the verdict, Claire approached him in the hallway. "You kept your promise," she said softly. Mark shook his head. "You kept it alive. I just followed it home." That evening, Claire drove alone to the wooded area near Riverside Drive, the place where Eli's bike had been found. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain. She knelt beside a small marker placed there years earlier and whispered, "You can rest now, sweetheart." Her tears fell silently onto the earth. Across town, Mark packed his desk for the last time. His badge lay beside a note scrawled in his own handwriting. "Some cases solve us more than we solve them." As night fell over Tulsa, both of them, the mother who never gave up and the detective who couldn't let go, found themselves standing at the edge of something rare. Not peace, not closure, but truth, quietly settling like dust after a long, relentless storm. 17 years had passed since that grey Thursday, when justice was finally spoken aloud in a Tulsa courtroom. Time had dulled the noise of the headlines, but not the echo of what happened. The old St. Matthew's Church still stood, its bricks weathered and its steeple slightly leaning, a quiet monument to both faith and loss. Every April, fresh flowers appeared near the path where Eli Parker had once ridden his bike. No one ever saw who left them. Claire Parker, now in her 50s, ran a foundation that helped families of missing children across Oklahoma. Her office walls were lined with photos, faces of the found and the still missing, each one carrying its own story. "We don't forget," she often told new volunteers. "Forgetting is how we lose them twice." One afternoon, as she prepared for a memorial event, a young intern asked her, "Mrs. Parker, how do you still do this after so many years?" Claire smiled gently, her voice calm but firm. "Because someone did it for me when I couldn't stand up. Because there's always another parent waiting for a call that might never come." Tulsa itself had changed. The fields where the first search parties gathered were now neighborhoods filled with laughter and motion. The city had healed on the surface, but deep down there were scars that never truly faded. Each time a child went missing, even briefly, people still whispered the name Eli Parker, a reminder of what vigilance meant. Detective Mark Holloway, retired for nearly a decade, lived quietly outside town. His hair had turned silver, and the lines around his eyes told stories no report ever could. On most mornings he sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the sunrise. Sometimes he thought about the case, the faces, the late nights, but more often he thought about the promise he'd made, and how keeping it had changed him more than anything else in his career. When Claire's Foundation invited him to speak at their annual remembrance event in 2020, he almost declined. But the handwritten note that arrived with the invitation changed his mind. "It would mean a lot, for both of us," she'd written. The day of the event was warm, the kind of spring day that felt like renewal. Claire stood at the podium first, addressing a small crowd gathered in the community center. "Eli's story isn't just mine," she said. "It belongs to this town, to everyone who searched, who hoped, who refused to let silence win." When she stepped down, Mark approached the microphone. His voice was low, gravelly with age. "We often talk about solving cases," he said, "but sometimes the truth is that cases solve us. They strip us down until all that's left is what we believe in." For me, that was a mother's faith that never broke. After the event, as the crowd dispersed, Claire and Mark exchanged a quiet look. No words were needed. Between them was a history written not in reports or headlines, but in endurance. Outside, the sun dipped behind the horizon, and the faint sound of church bells drifted through the air, an echo of 1998, soft, steady, and unending. By 2022, Tulsa had become a city that refused to let its ghosts fade quietly. The story of Eli Parker had become more than a tragedy. It was now a lesson, woven into the city's culture, a quiet reminder of vigilance, empathy, and the strength of a community that once broke and learned to rebuild. The old route Eli had taken to church was now part of a city trail, lined with oaks and memorial plaques. Halfway down the path, a bronze bench bore an inscription, "For every child who never made it home, and every heart that never stopped searching." Each spring, children from nearby schools painted small stones and left them by the bench, bright colors against the earth, symbols of remembrance that felt alive. At the local elementary school, a teacher read a passage from The Boy Who Never Made It to Church, a book inspired by Claire's journey. The classroom was silent as she finished the last line. "Why do we read this every year?" one boy asked. The teacher smiled softly. "Because stories keep people from disappearing again." Claire Parker, older now but still sharp-eyed, attended a safety program that her foundation helped create. Parents filled the auditorium, taking notes, asking questions, learning how to talk to their children about trust and awareness without fear. When Claire took the stage, she paused for a moment, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd. "Back then," she began, "we didn't have the resources we do now. We relied on faith and on each other. Today we have more tools, but faith and unity still matter most. Justice isn't revenge, it's remembrance, and remembrance is what keeps us human." Her words drew a quiet murmur of agreement. Afterward, several parents approached her, thanking her not for her loss but for what she had done with it. One mother said, "You made the world safer for my kids. That's not something anyone forgets." Claire smiled, the kind that carried both gratitude and exhaustion. "Then promise me you'll keep it safe," she said. Across town, Mark Holloway, older, walking with a slight limp now, read about the Foundation's work in the newspaper. The article featured a photograph of Claire at the podium, her expression calm and resolute. He folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the others he'd saved through the years. Later that week he attended the unveiling of the new memorial near the churchyard. When he arrived, Claire was already there, adjusting the flowers along the bench. "Didn't think you'd make it," she said, smiling faintly. "Wouldn't miss it," Mark replied. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind rustling through the oak leaves. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a nearby playground. "He'd be 37 now," Claire said quietly. Mark nodded. "Hard to imagine." Claire turned to him, her eyes reflecting both grief and peace. "Maybe not so hard. He's still here, just not the way we thought he'd be." As they stood there, the church bells began to ring, slow, steady, familiar. And for the first time, neither of them flinched. The sound no longer belonged to sorrow. It belonged to the living, to a town that had learned how to remember without breaking. It was a crisp autumn evening when Claire Parker visited the small memorial that had been built at the edge of the field near St. Matthew's Church. The trees had turned gold and crimson, and the air carried the soft scent of fallen leaves. Her steps were quiet as she approached the stone bench, a gentle breeze tugging at her coat. She knelt beside the plaque that read, "For Eli Parker, whose memory lights the way for those who are lost." Her fingers brushed the letters, worn smooth by years of hands that had come here to remember, to pray, to reflect. A single yellow flower, its petals curled and delicate, lay at the base of the stone. "Still here," she whispered, her voice barely above the wind. "Still with us, in a way." Her mind drifted to the days after his disappearance, to the silence that had swallowed her whole. The years that followed had been filled with a pain that only a mother could know, but it had also been shaped by a quiet, stubborn hope. Even when others gave up, Claire refused. She held on, not just for herself, but for Eli, for the boy who had been too young to disappear, for the boy whose life had meant something, even if the world had failed to understand that at first. Now, after everything, the fight had brought her peace, a strange, unexpected kind of peace. There was no closure, no full return of the past, but the truth had been found, and Eli had not been forgotten. Behind her, Mark Holloway stood watching, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had never said it aloud, but he understood that the truth, real, painful, and raw, could also be a kind of light. The city had rebuilt itself after the storm, and so had its people. Claire stood and turned toward him, her eyes soft but steady. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her words carrying a weight of years and gratitude. "I wouldn't be anywhere else," Mark replied. His voice was low, but there was warmth in it now. The detective who had once hunted for answers had found something else in the search, something deeper, something human. The two of them stood together, watching the last remnants of the sunset slip behind the trees. The sky was bruised with purple and orange, fading into the quiet of the evening. The church bells tolled softly, their sound deep and familiar. For the first time, Claire felt a sense of calm settle in her chest. The struggle had not been in vain. The community had endured, and the memory of Eli would not be allowed to fade into the past. "No matter where life takes us," she said, her voice firm with the conviction of a mother who had fought with every ounce of strength, "this light won't go out. Not for him, not for anyone." Mark nodded in agreement, his eyes on the horizon. "Some stories," he murmured, "don't end. They just get carried forward." As they stood there, the wind picking up around them, Claire felt a quiet certainty settle deep within her heart. Eli was gone, but his legacy, the truth, the fight, the memory, would remain, lighting the way for those who would never stop searching.